The butter was shaped like a seashell, sweating on a small porcelain plate that probably cost more than the shirt I was wearing. I watched it melt, losing its form, becoming a yellow slick. It was a perfect representation of the morning. I've spent 12 years as a structural surveyor. I'm paid to notice when things lose their shape. I notice the hairline fracture in the load-bearing pillar before the architect even arrives. I notice when a foundation is settling unevenly, and I noticed, with a clarity that felt like a physical weight, that I was the only person at this table who wasn't considered a person. We were at the Ledger, a place where the acoustics are designed to swallow the sound of money-changing hands. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. My father, Franklin, sat at the head of the table, his posture as rigid as the vintage masonry he prided himself on owning. To his right was my sister, Meredith, who was currently performing the role of exhausted but radiant mother. Her 2 children were busy coloring on the linen tablecloth with expensive-looking crayons they'd brought from home. My son sat next to me. He's 8. He was staring at the glass of water in front of him, watching the condensation trails. He didn't have a coloring book. He didn't have a menu. "The Wagyu sliders are excellent here," Franklin said, his voice carrying that practiced mayoral resonance, "and the lobster frittata. Meredith, tell them to bring out 3 orders of the truffle fries for the kids. Let's just start a spread." Meredith beamed, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Oh, Dad, you're too much. But the boys are famished. Soccer practice ran late because the private coach wanted to work on their footwork." "Only the best," Franklin nodded. He turned his gaze toward the waiter, a young man who looked like he'd been polished with a soft cloth. Franklin gestured vaguely toward me and my son, his expression shifting from expansive warmth to a clinical, detached neutrality. It was the look he gave a line item on a balance sheet that didn't quite add up. "And for those 2?" the waiter asked, pen poised. "The boy will have the dry toast," Franklin said, his tone casual, dismissive. He didn't look at my son. He looked at the wine list. "And some tap water. Buy cheap for your kid, Quinton. We're not paying for the extras today." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was pressurized. I felt the atmosphere in the room change, the way the air thins before a storm. I looked at my son. He didn't flinch. He didn't complain. He just pulled his hands back from the table and rested them in his lap, shrinking into his seat until he was almost invisible. He'd learned this dance. He'd learned that in this family there was a hierarchy of value, and he was currently ranked somewhere below the truffle fries. "The toast is fine," I said. My voice was level. I've spent my life delivering bad news to property owners in a level voice. The soil is unstable, the joists are rotting. Your investment is a shell. It's a voice that doesn't invite argument. Meredith didn't even look up. She was too busy cutting her son's imported ham into tiny, perfect squares. "Anyway, Dad, about the summer camp. The deposit went through. It's the one with the sailing program and the junior equestrian track. It's pricey, but it's an investment in their social circle, right?" "Absolutely," Franklin said. "I'll wire the rest of the tuition on Monday. Family supports family." I watched them. I watched the way Franklin's hand moved as he poured more sparkling water, a heavy gold ring catching the light. I thought about the 3 inspections I'd done for him last month. Unpaid, of course. I'd spent 6 hours in a cramped, damp crawlspace beneath one of his commercial strips, documenting a drainage issue that would have cost him a fortune in litigation if it had gone ignored. I'd saved him $50,000 in a single afternoon. Noted. The food arrived. It was a parade of decadence. Silver domes were lifted to reveal mountains of food that no one would actually finish. The smell of truffle oil and clarified butter filled the air. In front of my son, the waiter placed a small, chipped side plate with 2 slices of white bread, scorched and dry. No butter, no jam. Just the basics. My son picked up a piece of the toast. The crunch it made was the loudest thing at the table. "Quinton," Meredith said, waving a forkful of lobster. "Don't be like that. You know how Dad is about budgeting for the fiscal year. You should have planned better if you wanted him to do the big brunch thing for everyone." "I planned perfectly, Meredith," I said. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my surveyor's pen. It's a heavy, professional instrument, weighted for precision. The waiter returned a few minutes later, hovering tentatively with the leather-bound folder containing the bill. Franklin usually made a show of grabbing it, a theatrical display of his role as the provider. But this time, I reached out first. My hand was faster. I took the folder. "I've got this," I said. Franklin chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Don't be ridiculous, Quinton. You can't afford this table. Just pass it over." "I'm not paying for the table," I said. I opened the folder. The total was astronomical. There were charges for vintage champagne I hadn't touched, appetizers that had been picked at and discarded, and the elaborate entrees Meredith's children were currently throwing at each other. I didn't feel angry. Anger is a structural flaw. It makes you move too fast and miss the details. I felt cold, calculated, and entirely finished. Using the pen, I drew a single, heavy line through every item on the list. I crossed out the Wagyu sliders. I crossed out the lobster. I crossed out the 3 bottles of wine and the imported sparkling water. I left 2 items untouched, the dry toast and the glass of tap water. At the bottom of the bill, I wrote a precise calculation of the market rate for 3 structural surveys of commercial properties, minus the cost of 1 order of toast. "What are you doing?" Franklin's voice lost its mayoral warmth. It became sharp, like a jagged piece of glass. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. In a room this quiet, a whisper carries further than a scream. "I'm paying for what we consumed," I said, sliding the folder toward the center of the table. "My son had the toast, I had the water. The rest of this is yours, all of it. The food, the bill, and the expectation that I'll continue to subsidize your lifestyle with my labor." "You're being embarrassing," Meredith hissed, her face flushing a blotchy red. "Sit down. You're making a scene." "No," I said, looking her directly in the eye. "I'm making an adjustment. The load on this table has been poorly distributed for a long time. I'm just bringing it back into balance." I looked at my son. "Ready?" Oh, he nodded, his eyes wide but clear. For the first time all morning, he didn't look like he was trying to disappear. He stood up and tucked his chair in, neat, orderly, just the way I'd taught him. "Quinton, if you walk out of here, don't think you're getting another dime of help from this family," Franklin threatened. His face was a mask of controlled fury. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized the foundation of his house was made of sand, but was still trying to order the curtains. "Help?" I asked. I almost laughed. "Franklin, you haven't helped me in a decade. You've used me as a free consultant, a safety net, and a convenient target for your petty power plays. But today, the consulting firm of Quinton Nash is officially closed to family members." I leaned down, placing my hands on the edge of the table. I could feel the slight vibration of the restaurant's ventilation system. I knew exactly where the weak points in this building were. I knew exactly where the weak points in this family were, too. "Enjoy the lobster," I said. "I hope it was worth the price." I turned and walked out. I didn't look back to see the look on Meredith's face or the way Franklin would have to scramble to find his credit card when the manager arrived to discuss the defaced bill. I walked through the heavy oak doors and into the bright, sharp sunlight of the coastal morning. The air felt different outside. It felt lighter. We reached the car, a sensible, well-maintained SUV that I kept in perfect mechanical order. I buckled my son into his seat. He looked at me for a long moment, his small face thoughtful. "Dad?" he asked. "Yeah, kiddo." "Are we going to have to see them again?" "Not for a while," I said. I started the engine. The dashboard hummed to life, a series of glowing lights indicating that every system was green, every sensor was functioning. "We're going to go get a real breakfast now, whatever you want. Pancakes, eggs, the works." "Can I have chocolate chips?" "You can have the whole bag," I told him. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced at the restaurant in the rearview mirror. It looked expensive and permanent, a monument to the kind of people who thought they could ignore the laws of physics and social debt indefinitely. They thought I was the one who was being cut off. They thought they were the ones holding the power because they held the purse strings. They were wrong. In my mind, I was already reviewing the files on my laptop. I was thinking about the zoning permits I'd helped Franklin navigate, the safety violations I'd interpreted with a degree of leniency that I now deeply regretted, and the various ways Meredith's husband had used my professional seal to bypass city ordinances on his new development project. I hadn't just been a surveyor, I had been the glue. I had been the one making sure the cracks didn't show, the one ensuring the inspector looked the other way, the one providing the expertise that kept their fragile empires from tilting. If I stopped being the glue, things would start to slide. It wouldn't happen all at once. It would be a slow, grinding process. A crack here, a shifted beam there, a failed inspection that leads to a revoked permit that leads to a lost investment. I had spent my life building things up and keeping them steady. Now I wanted to see what happened when I simply stepped back and let the weight of their own choices do the work. This morning wasn't a singular event. It was the first sign of a systemic collapse. I looked at the road ahead, the gray ribbon of asphalt stretching toward the suburbs, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of genuine anticipation. They had told me to buy cheap. They had told me my son wasn't worth the price of a meal. Noted. I drove away from the water, toward the city, my mind already calculating the exact amount of pressure required to make the whole thing buckle. It wouldn't take much, just the right amount of silence in the right places. The silence in my home office was different than the silence at the restaurant. At the restaurant, it had been a vacuum, a hollow space created by the absence of respect. Here, it was the silence of a laboratory. It was productive. I sat at my desk, the glow of 3 monitors illuminating the room in a cool, clinical blue. My son was asleep down the hall, curled under a quilt I'd bought him when I realized Franklin wouldn't even remember his birthday, let alone send a gift. I opened a folder titled Family Pro Bono. It was a massive archive. For years, I had treated my family's requests as a secondary job, a duty that sat on my shoulders like a heavy coat I wasn't allowed to take off. I began to scroll through the digital footprints of a decade of exploitation. There were emails from Meredith asking me to just take a quick peek at the foundation of her new home before she signed the closing papers, a peek that had turned into a 40-page structural integrity report that saved her from a 6-figure repair bill. There were frantic texts from Franklin at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday asking for an unofficial assessment of a warehouse he was eyeing, wanting to know if he could squeeze another floor of storage out of the existing joists without filing for new permits. I had done it all. I had calculated the load-bearing capacities, verified the soil stability, and checked the moisture levels in the masonry. I had signed off on informal documents that allowed them to secure bank loans and insurance policies. I had been the invisible infrastructure holding their financial lives upright. And in return, I was told to buy cheap bread for my child. I pulled up a spreadsheet. I'm a man of data, and data is the most honest thing in the world. It doesn't lie to make you feel better, and it doesn't try to manipulate you with talk of legacy or loyalty. I began to input the market value for every hour of specialized labor I had provided for free over the last 5 years. I factored in the industry standard for emergency consultations, the cost of professional liability, and the sheer volume of savings my interventions had generated. The number at the bottom of the screen was staggering. It wasn't just a few $1,000s, it was a fortune. My sister's lifestyle, the equestrian lessons, the private tutors, the designer labels, was built on a foundation of my stolen time. Franklin's property empire was profitable because he had a high-level surveyor on speed dial who didn't charge a fee. I looked at the number and felt a strange, detached sense of relief. The imbalance was finally quantified. The next step required a physical audit. I grabbed my gear bag, my laser measure, my high-intensity flashlight, and my heavy-duty tablet, and headed out. It was nearly midnight, the coastal fog rolling in from the harbor and wrapping the street lamps in a hazy yellow glow. I drove to the industrial district, to one of Franklin's flagship holdings, a converted warehouse now serving as a luxury furniture showroom. I still had the master key on my ring. Franklin had given it to me 3 years ago when a pipe burst in the basement and he didn't want to drive out himself. As the lock turned with a familiar click, I felt a shift in my own internal geometry. I wasn't here to fix anything tonight. I wasn't here to provide a solution. I was here to document the reality that I had previously chosen to ignore for the sake of peace. Inside, the air smelled of expensive wood polish and old brick. I moved through the shadows, my flashlight cutting a sharp path through the dark. I climbed the iron stairs to the mezzanine. Last year, I'd noticed a slight deflection in the secondary support beams. Franklin had asked if it was safe enough, and I had told him that with regular monitoring and no additional weight, it would hold. I had even performed the monitoring myself, checking the tension every 6 months without being asked. I stood on the mezzanine and aimed the laser measure at the ceiling. The deflection had increased by 4 millimeters. It wasn't an emergency, but it was a violation of the building code I had been shielding him from. I took a photo. Then I moved to the basement, where the salt air was slowly eating away at the mortar of the foundation. I'd warned him about the seepage before. He'd told me to patch it up and keep it off the official record so his insurance rates wouldn't spike. I didn't patch it tonight. I simply held my tablet up and recorded the dampness, the crumbling stone, and the clear signs of structural fatigue. I did this for 2 hours, moving through the building like a ghost haunting his own previous kindness. I was gathering the truth. When I returned to the car, I felt energized. I opened my social media profile. I rarely posted anything personal. My life was usually a series of architectural photos and technical updates. But tonight, I chose a photo from my phone. It was from 2 hours earlier, after I'd taken my son to a late-night diner. It showed a massive plate of steak and eggs, a side of hash browns, and a milkshake that was mostly whipped cream. My son's hand was in the corner of the frame, reaching for a fry. I captioned it. "Quality has a price. Gladly paid." I hit post. It was a small stone thrown into a still pond, but I knew the ripples would reach the people who needed to feel them. The next morning, the phone calls started. I didn't answer. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking black coffee and watching the sunrise over the neighbors' roof lines. Meredith called 4 times. Franklin called once, leaving a voicemail that started with a forced, jovial tone and ended with a sharp command to call him back immediately. Around 10 a.m., I received an email from a former friend, a developer named Marcus, who had often used my reports to help his clients flip properties quickly. "Hey Quinton, saw the post. Little cryptic, buddy. Anyway, I've got that report on the Miller Street project due tomorrow. You said you'd have the final sign-off ready by Monday morning. The buyers are getting twitchy. Send it over when you can." I replied with 2 sentences. I am no longer providing uncompensated assessments. My professional rate for this project is now a flat fee of $5,000, payable up front. His response came back in less than 90 seconds. "Is this a joke? We've been doing this for years. I've steered so much business your way, even if it was the small stuff. Don't be a jerk over a brunch argument with your old man." I didn't reply. I simply archived the thread. I spent the rest of the day with my son. We went to the park, we played catch, and we didn't talk about the family. I watched him run, his laughter bright and untethered, and I realized how much of my own stress he had been absorbing. He had seen me bending over backward for people who didn't value us, and he had learned to be small because he thought that was the price of belonging. No more. That evening, I returned to my office to find a series of increasingly desperate messages. The Miller Street project was apparently on the verge of falling through because the bank required my specific certification to release the funds. Without my signature, the deal was stalled. Marcus was losing his commission, and the buyers were threatening to walk. Then came the message from Franklin. It wasn't a voicemail this time. It was a formal-sounding email, though I could hear his grinding teeth through the text. "Quinton, I don't know what kind of stunt you're trying to pull, but the warehouse on 4th has an insurance audit scheduled for Wednesday. I need your updated safety log for the mezzanine. Meredith tells me you're not answering her texts about her kitchen remodel either. Stop this nonsense. We are family. You have a responsibility to the legacy I've built." I sat back in my chair, the leather creaking. Legacy, he called it. It was a legacy of shortcuts and favors, a house of cards built on the assumption that I would always be there to hold up the walls. I pulled up the safety log for the warehouse. It was a digital document, meticulously maintained by me for 3 years. It was the only thing standing between Franklin and a massive fine, or perhaps even a forced closure of the showroom. I looked at the Save button, then I looked at the Delete button. I did neither. I simply moved the file into a password-protected drive that was no longer synced to the family server. I wasn't destroying the evidence of his neglect. I was simply removing my protection of it. I was withdrawing my presence from the system. In structural engineering, there is a concept called progressive collapse. It's what happens when one key element fails and the load is transferred to other elements that aren't designed to handle it. They fail in turn, and the whole structure comes down in a chain reaction. I had been the key element. I stood up and went to the window. In the distance, I could see the lights of the city, the skyline a jagged graph of ambition and concrete. Somewhere out there, Franklin and Meredith were sitting in their well-appointed rooms, growing increasingly anxious as the silence from my end of the line continued. They were beginning to feel the weight of their own lives. They were realizing that the cheap son they had dismissed was actually the only thing keeping their world level. I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. I wasn't being cruel. I wasn't being violent. I was simply being accurate. I was reflecting the value they had placed on me back at them. If I was worth nothing, then my work was worth nothing. And if my work was worth nothing, then their buildings, their deals, and their reputations were all in serious trouble. I went to my son's room and checked on him one last time. He was sprawled out, a picture of absolute peace. I straightened his blanket and stepped back into the hallway. The accounting was over. The pressure was beginning to build, and I was the only one who knew exactly where the first break would happen. The sound of my phone vibrating against the mahogany surface of my desk was the only rhythm in the room. It was 8:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, the time when the gears of the city's real estate machine usually began to grind. I watched the screen light up with Marcus's name for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. I didn't pick up. Instead, I opened my laptop and sent a formal notification to the city building department. It wasn't an anonymous tip or a whistleblowing report. It was a simple, professional resignation. I was withdrawing my name as the surveyor of record for 4 of Franklin's major properties and 3 of Marcus's ongoing developments. In the eyes of the law, a building without a surveyor of record is a liability in waiting. It's a ship without a navigator. By withdrawing, I wasn't accusing them of anything. I was merely stating that I was no longer responsible for verifying the safety of their structures. The system would do the rest. The first physical manifestation of the shift happened 2 hours later. I was at a local coffee shop, one of those quiet places where people go to work in anonymous peace, when the glass door swung open with more force than necessary. Meredith stepped inside. She looked frantic, her expensive silk blouse slightly wrinkled, her phone clutched in her hand like a weapon. She scanned the room and locked onto me. She didn't wait to reach the table. "Quinton, what are you doing? Marcus called me. He's losing his mind. He said you sent him an invoice for $5,000 for a report you already promised him." I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was hot and bitter. I didn't promise him a free report, Meredith. I provided a courtesy service for years. The courtesy has ended. She sat down opposite me, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. "This isn't just about Marcus. Dad is at the 4th Street warehouse right now. The insurance auditor showed up early and they're asking for the maintenance logs. He can't find them on the shared drive. He thinks there's a technical glitch." "There's no glitch," I said. "The logs are on my private server. Since I am no longer the surveyor for that property, I am no longer required to provide the owner with real-time access to my working notes." Meredith's eyes widened. "You're holding them hostage? Quinton? That's his livelihood. That warehouse is the centerpiece of the portfolio. If the insurance company flags the mezzanine, they'll pull his coverage by the end of the week. Do you have any idea what that does to his bank loans?" "I have a very precise idea," I replied. "I'm a surveyor. I understand how one failure leads to a total collapse of the financial structure. It's just physics, Meredith. If the support is removed, the weight has to go somewhere." "You're being cruel," she whispered, though her voice was sharp enough to make the person at the next table glance over. "Over a brunch? Over a comment about a piece of toast? You're going to destroy everything Dad worked for because your feelings were hurt?" I leaned forward, my voice dropping into that calm, resonant tone I used when explaining a structural flaw to a skeptical board of directors. "This isn't about feelings, Meredith. It's about value. For years, I was told, by you, by him, that my time and my expertise were worth less than the cost of a meal for my son. You used my professional seal to build your houses and secure your loans, while you treated me like a convenience. If my work is so worthless, then you shouldn't mind that I've stopped doing it. If it's as important as you're claiming now, then you should have paid for it." She opened her mouth to argue, but her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, and I saw her face pale. "It's the school," she muttered. She answered it, her voice trembling. "Hello? Yes. What? No, the deposit was sent. There must be a mistake." She listened for another minute, her hand gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. "I'll call you back." She hung up and looked at me, her expression shifting from anger to a desperate, ugly confusion. "The summer camp. They said the wire transfer from Dad's account was flagged. Something about a secondary lien on the property he used as collateral." I nodded slightly. "The 4th Street warehouse. When I withdrew as the surveyor of record, the city's automated system sent a notification to the primary lenders. Standard procedure. When a property loses its safety certification, the bank usually freezes the associated credit lines until a new inspection is performed. It takes about 48 hours for the system to cycle through." "You did this," she said, her voice rising. "You knew his credit was tied to that building." "I knew the building was unstable," I corrected. "I was the one keeping it stable. I just stopped." Meredith stood up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You're a monster, Quinton. You're hurting your own nephews. They've been talking about this camp all year." "They'll learn a valuable lesson about the importance of sound foundations," I said. "Perhaps they can spend the summer at the park. It's free." She turned and marched out, the bell above the door jangling in her wake. I watched her go, feeling nothing but a profound sense of clarity. The system was working exactly as it was designed to. When the truth is revealed, the illusions must vanish. I spent the afternoon at a job site for a new client, a municipal project that paid well and respected my hours. It was refreshing to work in an environment where my word was the final authority and my invoice was settled within 30 days. But the peace was short-lived. As I was leaving the site, a black sedan pulled up to the curb, blocking my exit. Marcus stepped out. He looked different than he had at the restaurant. The swagger was gone, replaced by a frantic, sweating energy. He didn't look like a successful developer. He looked like a man who was about to lose a lot of other people's money. "Quinton, we need to talk," he said, stepping into my path. "I have a dinner date with my son Marcus. If you want a consultation, call my office in the morning." "I don't have until the morning," he shouted, then quickly lowered his voice as a group of workers walked by. "The Miller Street deal. The buyers saw the city's notice that you withdrew. They're spooked. They think there's something wrong with the building that you're not telling them. They're demanding an independent audit, but that will take weeks. I need you to go back on record, just for 48 hours. Sign the final clearance, and I'll give you the 5,000. Hell, I'll give you 10. I looked at him, noticing the way his expensive tie was knotted slightly off-center. The building has a hairline fracture in the western load-bearing wall, Marcus. I told you about it 6 months ago. You told me to monitor it instead of fixing it because you didn't want to delay the sale. It's just a settling crack, he hissed. It's not going anywhere. Maybe not. But I won't sign a document saying it's perfect when I know it's not. I was willing to work with you on a remediation plan because we were friends, but you made it clear that my friendship was just another resource you could exploit for free. I don't work for free, and I don't lie for people who don't respect me. You're going to ruin me, Marcus said, his voice cracking. I've got everything tied up in this flip. If this deal falls through, the holding costs will eat me alive. Then you should have fixed the wall, I said, stepping around him. He grabbed my arm. It wasn't a violent gesture, but it was an aggressive one. You think you're so much better than us? You're just a glorified bean counter with a tape measure. You're nothing without the people who actually build things. I looked down at his hand on my sleeve, then up at his face. I didn't pull away. I didn't need to. I felt a surge of cold, quiet power. The people who build things usually make sure the ground is solid first, Marcus. You just built a facade, and now the wind is picking up. He let go of my arm, his face twisted in a mixture of fear and loathing. Your father was right about you. You're cold. You've always been cold. I prefer the term thermally stable, I said. I got into my car and drove away, leaving him standing on the sidewalk in the shadow of a building he couldn't sell. In the rearview mirror, he looked small, a frantic figure diminishing as I moved toward the horizon. The psychological shift was complete. For years, I had been the one worrying about Franklin's insurance, worrying about Meredith's house, worrying about Marcus's deals. I had carried their anxiety for them, neutralizing it with my labor. Now I had simply handed it back. It was their burden now. I was just the observer. When I got home, the house was quiet. My son was in the living room, building a complex structure out of wooden blocks. He was focused, his tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth as he carefully balanced a long plank across 2 pillars. Careful, buddy, I said, sitting on the sofa nearby. The center of gravity is shifting. He looked at me and smiled. I know, Dad. I'm building it so it doesn't need me to hold it. I felt a lump in my throat that had nothing to do with sadness. That's the best way to build anything, I told him. My phone rang again. This time I didn't even check the name. I turned it off and placed it face down on the coffee table. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the floor. The world was full of structures under tension, of systems straining under the weight of their own imbalances. But here, in this room, everything was perfectly level. For now. I knew the final confrontation was coming. I knew that Franklin wouldn't go down without a fight, and that Meredith would use every emotional trick in her arsenal to try and restore the old order. But they were fighting against the inevitable. They were fighting against the data, and the data always wins. I watched my son add the final block to his tower. It stood perfectly still, a small, elegant testament to the power of getting the basics right. The realization did not arrive as a grand epiphany. It came through a series of metadata tags and old scanned PDFs. I was sitting in my kitchen at 3 a.m, the hum of the refrigerator the only companion to my investigation. I had been digging into the legacy files of the Rhodes Property Group, the entity that housed Franklin's life work. I wasn't looking for a scandal. I was looking for the paperwork on my own childhood home, curious about the original deed. What I found instead was a legal maneuver so precise and so cold that it made my father's dismissive comments at brunch seem like a gesture of affection by comparison. 5 years ago, Franklin had restructured the entire family trust. He had done it quietly, using a law firm 3 towns over. The documents were ironclad. He had partitioned the property portfolio into 2 distinct tiers. The first tier, containing the high-value commercial assets and the primary residential holdings, had been moved into a shell company where Meredith was listed as the sole successor. The second tier, a collection of aging, liability-heavy properties with mounting maintenance issues, was designated as my inheritance. But there was a catch, a clause buried in the fine print. The transfer of the second tier was contingent upon me maintaining professional oversight of the first tier until Franklin's retirement. He had effectively written a contract that turned me into a permanent, unpaid servant for Meredith's future wealth. He had used my own expertise to vet the properties she would own, while ensuring that the only things I would ever possess were the problems he didn't want to solve. The betrayal was baked into the very soil of the family history. It wasn't just favoritism. It was a planned, multi-year extraction of my life's value for the benefit of his chosen heir. I closed the laptop. The blue light felt like a physical residue on my skin. I went to the window and watched the streetlights flicker. I wasn't hurt. That was the surprising part. I felt the kind of relief a doctor feels when they finally identify the source of a chronic infection. Now that I knew the pathology, I could determine the treatment. The confrontation happened 2 days later. I had ignored every call until Franklin sent a message that simply read, "The 4th Street site. Noon. Be there or I'm calling the police to report the theft of company records." It was a bluff. I owned those files. But it was an invitation I was ready to accept. The 4th Street warehouse was a cavernous, echoing shell of a building. The luxury furniture had been moved out to protect it from the moisture I had documented, leaving the space feeling skeletal and exposed. The air was thick with the smell of dust and stagnant humidity. Franklin was standing near the center of the floor, his silhouette framed by the towering windows. He looked smaller here, surrounded by the evidence of his own deteriorating investments. "You're late," he said, his voice bouncing off the brick walls. "I'm exactly on time for the conversation we should have had 5 years ago," I replied. I walked toward him, my boots clicking rhythmically on the concrete. I didn't stop until I was 5 feet away. "I want the passwords, Quinton, and I want you to sign the retraction for the city. Now. I've already spoken to a lawyer. What you're doing is professional sabotage. It's a breach of fiduciary duty." "I don't have a fiduciary duty to you, Franklin. I'm a contractor who was never paid. If anything, the city would be more interested in why you've been operating a commercial space without valid safety logs for the last quarter." "We're family," he roared, the sound startling a flock of pigeons in the rafters. "Everything I built was for you and your sister. You're throwing away your own future for the sake of a petty grudge." "My future?" I asked, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous calm. "I saw the trust documents, Franklin. I saw the tears. I saw how you positioned Meredith to take the assets while I was slated to inherit the liabilities. You didn't build this for me. You built this on me." Franklin's expression shifted. The anger didn't vanish, but it was joined by a flicker of something else. Calculation. He didn't deny it. Men like Franklin don't apologize for their maneuvers. They only justify them. "Meredith isn't like you," he said, his voice hardening. "She doesn't have a trade. She doesn't have your brain. She needs the protection. You can always make a living. You're a surveyor. You'll always be fine. I had to ensure the family's social standing was preserved through her. By making me her unpaid janitor, by letting my son sit at the end of the table while you financed her children's equestrian dreams with the money I saved you, you used my silence as a resource. You treated my competence as a reason to exploit me. It's the way of the world, Quinton. The strong support the weak." "No," I said, stepping closer. "In a structure, the foundation supports the weight. But if the weight becomes too heavy, or if the foundation realizes it's being crushed for no reason, it can choose to shift. And when the foundation shifts, the whole house comes down." I turned to leave, but Franklin moved with surprising speed, blocking the exit toward the main loading dock. "You aren't walking away from this. I'll make sure you never work in this city again. I'll ruin your reputation. I'll tell everyone you're unstable. I'll take that kid of yours and show him exactly what kind of failure his father is." I stopped. The air in the warehouse seemed to thicken. I looked at my father, this man who thought he could use my son as a bargaining chip, and I felt a final, clean break in my internal architecture. "You'll do nothing," I said. My voice was steady, devoid of the heat he was expecting. "Because if you mention my son again, or if you attempt to interfere with my professional life, I won't just withdraw my services. I will provide a full, certified audit of every property you own to the city council, the tax board, and the insurance underwriters. I have the data, Franklin. I have the moisture readings, the stress fractures, and the permit deviations you asked me to hide. I won't have to lie. I'll just have to be very, very honest." He looked at me, his chest heaving. For the first time in my life, I saw him realize that he had no leverage. He had spent 35 years assuming that my quietness was a sign of submission. He had never understood that I was simply collecting information. "You'd destroy the family name?" he whispered. "You already did that when you put a price tag on my son's meal," I said. "I'm just clearing the site for something new." I walked around him. He didn't try to stop me this time. He stood in the center of his empty warehouse, a man who owned a lot of brick and mortar but had no ground left to stand on. As I reached the door, I heard him call out one last time. "You're a villain, Quinton. You're a monster to your own blood." I paused at the threshold, the sunlight from the street blindingly bright. I didn't feel like a villain. I felt like a man who had finally finished a very long, very difficult job. I had assessed the situation, identified the terminal flaws, and recommended the only viable course of action: total demolition. If being the villain means I don't have to carry your weight anymore, I said, without turning around, then I accept the role. I drove away, the city air feeling cool and sharp against my face. I knew what would happen next. Franklin would try to find another surveyor, but anyone with a grain of sense would see the state of the properties and run the other way. Meredith would try to leverage her social connections, but social standing is a fickle thing when your credit is frozen and your assets are under investigation. I reached the school just as the afternoon bell was ringing. My son came running out, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. He saw me and his face lit up. A pure, uncomplicated joy that was worth more than every property in Franklin's portfolio. "Hey, Dad," he shouted, throwing himself into a hug. "Are we going to the park?" "Not just the park," I said, swinging him into the air. "We're going to start planning our own project. Something solid." "Like a treehouse?" "Bigger than that," I told him. "Much bigger." As we drove home, I felt the last of the old tension dissipate. The betrayal was no longer a secret. The pressure was no longer mine to manage. I had redefined the system, and for the first time in my life, I was the one setting the parameters. The collapse of the Rhodes Property Group was now an inevitability, a mathematical certainty that would play out in the coming weeks. I looked at my son in the rearview mirror. He was looking out the window, watching the buildings go by. He didn't know about the trust tiers or the structural failures or the empty threats. He just knew that he was seen. He knew he was valued. I had been the architect of my own misery for far too long, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, I realized that I had finally designed a life that could actually hold its own weight. The 3-act structure was moving into its final phase. The release of load was underway, and I was ready to watch the dust settle. The collapse of a system rarely happens with a single dramatic crash. Instead, it is a series of quiet, successive failures, each one a consequence of the one before. By Wednesday morning, the social and financial architecture of the Rhodes family had reached its tipping point. I spent the morning in my home office, watching the notifications arrive like digital hailstones. The bank had officially moved Franklin's primary commercial credit line to special mention status. In the world of high-stakes property management, that is the equivalent of a hairline fracture in a dam. Once the word spreads that the foundation is questionable, everyone starts looking for the exit. I received a notification that the local historical society had pulled their sponsorship from the annual gala Meredith chaired. They didn't cite the investigation, they simply mentioned a realignment of organizational priorities. It was a polite way of saying they didn't want their brand associated with a family whose assets were currently under a city-mandated safety review. The social standing Meredith had spent a decade cultivating was dissolving in real time, proving to be as porous as the unsealed brick in her basement. The final public confrontation was inevitable. It occurred at a neutral venue, the opening of a new municipal library wing I had personally certified. It was a high-visibility event, attended by city officials, local developers, and the kind of people who treat reputation as a currency. I was there as an honored guest, a recognition of my work in ensuring the project met the highest safety standards. Franklin and Meredith were there because they still believed they could charm their way out of a structural reality. I was standing near the buffet, a glass of mineral water in my hand, when I saw them approaching. They moved as a unit, a desperate phalanx of tailored wool and forced smiles. Franklin looked haggard, the skin beneath his eyes sagging like poorly hung drywall. Meredith was pale, her grip on her designer clutch so tight her fingers were ghost white. "Quinton," Franklin said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He didn't offer a handshake. "We need to talk, somewhere private." "I'm enjoying the event, Franklin," I said, my voice projecting just enough to be heard by the nearby councilman. "The acoustics in this wing are exceptional, don't you think? It's amazing what happens when you use the specified materials instead of the cheaper alternatives." Meredith flinched as if I'd struck her. "Stop it. People are looking. Do you have any idea what happened this morning? The school called again. They've revoked the boys' enrollment for next semester because the tuition check didn't clear. They said our account is under a regulatory hold." "It sounds like the bank is being thorough," I said. "They tend to get nervous when a portfolio's surveyor of record resigns and the safety logs go missing. It creates an unacceptable risk profile." "You're doing this in front of everyone?" Franklin hissed, stepping into my personal space. "You're going to air our laundry here? I made you, Quinton. I gave you your start. I paid for your degree." "You paid for an investment," I corrected him. "And then you tried to ensure that investment would serve you for free for the rest of your life. The problem with treating people like tools is that tools don't have a sense of equilibrium. People do." A few heads turned. I saw Marcus in the distance, looking away as soon as our eyes met. He was already distancing himself from the sinking ship. He knew that in this room my certification was gold and Franklin's word was lead. "We can fix this," Meredith said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. "We'll pay you. Whatever the back fees are, just sign the logs for the 4th Street site and tell the bank it was a clerical error. We can go back to how things were." "Things can't go back," I said. "The load has already shifted. You've spent years living in a house built on my silence, Meredith. I've just opened the windows and let the light in. You can't ask the light to go away once the rot has been seen." "I'll take everything from you," Franklin whispered, his face inches from mine. "I'll make sure you never get another city contract. I have friends on this board." I looked past him to the councilman, who was currently nodding in approval at a structural display I had designed. "Your friends are busy looking at the data, Franklin. And the data says I'm the most reliable surveyor in the coastal district. Meanwhile, your properties are currently listed as non-compliant on the public portal. In about an hour, the local news is going to run a story on the safety crisis in the industrial district. I wonder whose name will be in the first paragraph." Franklin's composure finally broke. He didn't yell, but the mask of the dignified patriarch crumbled, revealing a desperate, frightened old man. "Why? Why are you doing this to your own father? Is it really just because of a brunch? Because of a joke about the boy?" "It wasn't a joke," I said, my voice cold and precise. "It was a measurement. You measured my son's worth and found it to be 0. You measured my loyalty and found it to be infinite and free. You were wrong on both counts. I'm simply correcting the record." I turned my back on them. It was the most aggressive thing I could do, to simply stop acknowledging their existence in a room where they were used to being the center of attention. I walked toward the podium, where I was scheduled to give a brief technical overview of the library's seismic reinforcements. As I spoke to the crowd, I could see them in the back of the room. They weren't whispering anymore. They were standing in a circle of empty space, the other guests instinctively moving away as the smell of failure began to cling to them. Meredith was on her phone, likely trying to call another favor that would no longer be answered. Franklin was staring at the floor, looking for a flaw in the foundation that he would never find. The event ended an hour later. I walked out to the parking lot, the evening air feeling crisp and clean. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an automated alert from the city's building department. A stop work order had been issued for 3 of Marcus's developments, and a mandatory vacation notice had been posted on the 4th Street warehouse. The system was accelerating. I was almost to my car when Meredith intercepted me. She had clearly been waiting in the shadows. Her hair was disheveled, and the radiant mother facade had been replaced by a raw, jagged desperation. "You think you've won?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You've just made us all losers. If the family business goes under, there's no inheritance. There's no safety net for any of us, not even for you." "I don't need a safety net, Meredith," I said, unlocking my car. "I have a career. I have a reputation that I earned, not one I inherited or bought with someone else's labor. And as for my son, he's going to grow up knowing that his value isn't determined by a trust fund or a grandfather's whim. That's a better inheritance than anything Franklin could have left him." "You're heartless," she said, tears finally spilling over. "You're standing here watching your family fall apart, and you're enjoying it." "I'm not enjoying it," I said, looking at her one last time. "I'm observing it. It's what I do. I see the cracks, I note the cause, and I report the findings. If the building falls, it's not because the surveyor spoke up. It's because the builder was negligent." I got into the car and drove away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I knew exactly what was back there, a structure that had been failing for years, finally giving way to the gravity of its own choices. When I arrived home, my son was waiting for me. He was sitting on the porch, a book in his lap. He looked up and smiled, and I felt a sense of peace that no bank account or property deed could ever provide. "How was the speech, Dad?" he asked. "It went well," I said, sitting down beside him. "People like the library. It's a good building. It'll be there for a long time." "Because you made sure it was safe?" "Because we did the work the right way," I said, from the bottom up. Inside the house, I checked my email one last time. There was a message from a legal firm representing the primary lenders for the Rhodes Property Group. They were requesting a private consultation. They wanted to know if I would be willing to stay on as a consultant for the receivership, the entity that would take over the properties once Franklin was forced to liquidate. They were offering me a substantial fee to help them pick up the pieces. I thought about it for a moment. I thought about the warehouse, the office buildings, and the residential units. I thought about the years I had spent protecting those structures for a man who didn't respect me. I typed a brief reply. "I am available for a consultation. My rates are as follows." The irony wasn't lost on me. In the end, I wouldn't just be the one who watched it fall. I would be the one who helped the bank decide what was worth saving and what needed to be cleared away. I would be the one who determined the future of the road's legacy, one line item at a time. The fourth act was over. The fifth act was nearing its peak. Tomorrow, I would walk through the 4th Street warehouse with a team of forensic accountants and city inspectors. I would show them every crack I had noted, every shortcut I had witnessed, and every hidden flaw. The story was no longer about a family, it was about a renovation. And as any good surveyor knows, you can't start the renovation until you've removed the debris. I closed the laptop and went to help my son with his homework. The world was quiet, the air was still, and for the first time in my life, the foundation beneath my feet felt absolutely, undeniably solid. The storm arrived with a calculated intensity, as if the atmosphere itself had decided to finalize the audit I had started. The sky over the harbor was a bruised slate gray, and the wind whipped the rain into horizontal sheets that hammered against the glass of my SUV. I was parked outside the 4th Street warehouse. It was the final walkthrough. The bank had sent a team of representatives, and the city had sent a lead inspector. Even Marcus was there, huddled under a large black umbrella, looking like a man who had spent the last 48 hours realizing that his professional life was built on a series of precarious handshakes. Franklin arrived last. He didn't come in a sedan this time. He was driving an old truck I hadn't seen in years, a relic from the days when he actually visited his job sites instead of just managing them from a distance. He stepped out into the rain, his movement slow and stiff. He looked up at the warehouse, his flagship property, now draped in the neon-orange non-compliant tape that signaled its transition from asset to liability. We gathered in the loading dock, the massive steel door rattling in the wind. The interior was freezing, the air thick with the smell of wet concrete and ozone. The lead inspector, a woman named Sarah, who had no patience for family legacies, clicked her pen. "Mr. Nash," she said, looking at me, "you've provided the supplemental logs. We're here to verify the primary points of failure you've identified." "Of course," I said. My voice was calm, cutting through the sound of the rain on the corrugated metal roof. "We'll start with the mezzanine support. Then we'll move to the foundation seepage on the northern wall." We moved as a group. I led the way, my high-intensity flashlight illuminating the flaws I had spent years quietly managing. I pointed to the stress fractures in the secondary beams. I showed them the places where the mortar had turned to sand because the drainage system had never been properly installed. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't need to. The physical reality of the building was more damning than any speech I could have given. "This was all documented?" Sarah asked, her voice echoing in the vast space. "In my private logs, yes," I replied. I provided verbal warnings and informal reports to the ownership on multiple occasions. No remediation was authorized. Franklin stood at the edge of the light, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked like he wanted to speak, but the presence of the bank's forensic accountant, a man who was currently tallying the cost of these failures on a tablet, kept him silent. The power of the road's name had been neutralized by the sheer volume of the data. We reached the back of the building, where the storm was loudest. The wind was forcing water through the gaps in the window frames, creating small rivers that ran toward the center of the floor. "And the structural seal?" the accountant asked. "You mentioned a certification issue?" "The seal was never officially issued for this quarter," I said, looking directly at Franklin. "The owner was operating under a provisional permit that expired 30 days ago. Any insurance claims or bank covenants tied to this property are currently based on an invalid safety status." Meredith appeared in the doorway then. She was soaked through, her hair matted to her forehead. She had ignored the no entry signs. She walked toward us, her heels clicking sharply on the wet concrete. "Dad, the bank just froze the trust," she said, her voice high and thin, barely audible over the wind. "They said there's a total recall on the commercial loans. They're taking the house. They're taking everything." Franklin didn't look at her. He was staring at me. The hatred in his eyes was palpable, a physical force that filled the space between us. "You did it," he whispered. "You finally brought it down." "I didn't bring it down, Franklin," I said. "I just stopped holding it up. There's a difference." "You destroyed your sister's life," he shouted, the sound cracking as the wind howled through the rafters. "You destroyed your nephew's future, all because you wanted to feel big, all because you wanted to prove you were the smartest person in the room?" I stepped closer to him. The inspectors and the accountants stepped back, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't about building codes anymore. "I didn't want to be the smartest person in the room," I said. "I wanted to be a member of the family. I wanted my son to be treated with the same dignity you gave to your property. But you don't value people, Franklin. You value leverage. You thought I was a fixed asset, something you could use until it wore out and then discard. You forgot that even the most stable foundation has a limit. "We're going to be on the street," Meredith cried, grabbing my arm. Her grip was desperate, a frantic attempt to find a handhold in a world that was suddenly sliding away from her. "Quinton, please, tell them you made a mistake. Tell them the logs were wrong. You're the expert. They'll believe you." I looked down at her hand on my sleeve. It was the same sleeve Marcus had grabbed, the same sleeve Franklin had used to pull me into unpaid meetings for a decade. I gently but firmly uncoupled her fingers from my arm. "The logs aren't wrong, Meredith. The building is failing. And so is the lie you've been living. You wanted the lifestyle without the labor. You wanted the rewards without the responsibility. This is the bill coming due." "I'll sue you," Franklin said, though there was no conviction in his voice. "I'll spend every last cent I have to make sure you're discredited." "You don't have every last cent anymore," I reminded him. "The bank owns your assets, the city owns your permits, and the only person who knows how to fix any of this is me, and I'm not available." The lead inspector cleared her throat. "We've seen enough. This facility is officially condemned pending a full structural overhaul. Mr. Rhodes, you have 24 hours to secure the site. After that, the city will take possession for public safety reasons." The group began to disperse, headed back toward the warmth and safety of their cars. I stayed behind for a moment, watching as the inspectors marked the final points of the survey. Marcus lingered by the door, his eyes downcast. He had lost his commissions, his reputation, and his primary benefactor in a single week. He didn't even try to speak to me. He just vanished into the rain. Franklin and Meredith were the last to leave the floor. They walked out together, two figures silhouetted against the gray light of the loading dock. They looked small. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to fix their problems. I didn't feel the urge to offer a solution or a compromise. I felt the weight of their expectations lift off my shoulders, leaving me standing perfectly upright. I walked to my SUV. My son was in the passenger seat, reading a book by the light of a small reading lamp. He looked up and smiled as I climbed in, shaking the water from my coat. "Is the work finished, Dad?" he asked. "It's finished," I said. I started the engine, the familiar hum of the machine providing a sense of order. "The survey is complete." "Are we going home now?" "No," I said, looking at the road ahead. "We're going to the city. There's a new project starting on Monday, and I want to show you the site. It's a clean slate." As I pulled away from the warehouse, I looked in the mirror. I saw the orange tape fluttering in the storm, a thin, vibrant line marking the boundary between the past and the future. I saw the old truck sitting in the parking lot, abandoned as Franklin and Meredith sought shelter elsewhere. There was no epilogue needed. There was no need to wait and see how they would rebuild, or if they would ever forgive me. The structural integrity of the relationship had been compromised beyond repair, and the demolition was a success. The city lights appeared through the rain, a million points of light marking 1,000 different structures. I knew that some of them were solid and some of them were hollow. I knew that some were built on truth and some were built on exploitation. But I also knew that as long as I had my gear bag, my data, and my son, I would never be the one caught in the collapse. I accelerated, the tires gripping the wet asphalt with a precision I had spent a lifetime learning to trust. Behind me, the warehouse, the debt, and the name Rhodes faded into the gray. I was Quinton Nash. I was a structural surveyor, and for the first time in 35 years, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The weight was gone. The balance was restored. The story ended in motion, a steady, unwavering progress toward a destination of my own choosing. I turned onto the highway, the wipers clearing the windshield in a rhythmic, steady beat. The storm continued to rage, but inside the car, it was quiet. It was stable. It was done.